so excited to be talking to you about one of my favorite topics, both professionally and personally. Um, and I haven't prepared a presentation because I want to go through this quickly and leave time for questions, really. So make this as interactive as possible. So I'll talk a little bit through what I want to share with all of you, and then really want to hear from all of you and what your experience is. So, one of the things we often hear from people is when people talk about company culture, it really starts with saying, "Oh, that's how people behave when no one is looking. That's how you work. That's what you do when there isn't necessarily all this oversight happening." So, what does that mean, and where does that come from? And why do we talk about this thing as being something that intrinsically just happens? And is that a fallacy? I would say to a large extent, yes. I think culture is something that really needs to be cultivated, to be nurtured, to be built very intentionally. And here's why. If we look at our work environments, we are all facing a multitude of challenges. Anything from, there's just too much work to be done and not enough time in the day. Our work is getting really complex, not just for what's happening in the world right now with working remotely, but even otherwise, where companies are growing and they're growing sometimes at a very fast pace. You're bringing in a lot of people. You have to navigate how to work in the context of different cultures, possibly even working with colleagues in different locations and time zones. And how do you manage all of that? So there's a lot of complexity in how we engage. Then there's the complexity of how we work together. We can call this as like people get in each other's ways. Things like there might be differing expectations, or there isn't enough planning, or there's competing priorities, and then we get in our own ways sometimes. Where we have the imposter syndrome, or we feel a lot of pressure, we have self-doubt, we fear failing. So I just listed a whole bunch of challenges that we all face in our work environment to some degree. And how do we go about dealing with that? How do we be productive? How do we find the balance of getting our work done, having our lives not get too rocked by all of these challenges? And I think the answer to all of that is through the way that companies define culture, because that really presents itself in the way of how we work together. When you have a culture that you've set up, it tells people this is how we work with each other. This is how we operate in this working environment. And so that's what makes this so important, is because it has that crux of how are we going to work with each other. Particularly, again, right now in the situation that we're all facing, where most companies are trying to find a balance between, hey, how do we maintain connectivity, productivity, and sanity for our workforce? How do we kind of triangulate these three things? And and that's why this is so important from a tech perspective. From my point of view, how we work together determines what we work on, i.e. our roadmap, right? Like if I know this is how we're working, whether it's in an agile framework or a waterfall framework, or whether I know how we're all going to be coming together on what our vision is and what the goals are that we've set on our roadmap. So it determines what we work on. It determines who gets the work done. Our culture determines how do we think about promoting people internally, or how do we think about hiring people? How do we think about what it takes to grow in a specific role? And then how we work together also determines what we accomplish. How does it all tie into why we're doing the work that we're doing? How does this tie to our company's mission? How does it tie to the revenue goals that we've set, or the impact we want to create? That's why defining culture is so important, because it really does tell us a lot about what we're going to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. So then the obvious question is, okay, well, so what is culture, and how do you define a company's culture? We can go look at any company's website, and a lot of them talk about, they might call it their principles, they might call it their operating values, they might call it what we believe, or how do we work together. And a lot of companies have now started putting this online. And the thing with culture is, it it shouldn't just be, oh, take these keywords and put them out there. it really has to mean something to the company, because if it doesn't mean anything, then we don't know what to do with it or how to make it work, right? So as a company, I can put out there, we care about working together as teammates. Great. So that tells me that the company cares about having an environment where people work together. But how do you do that? What does it look like day to day? When I join the company, and if I'm a new employee, what does that tell me about how I'm going to be interacting with people that I work with? So it's really important, one, for defining these values or these core principles to be something that's really, really personal to the company. Has to be specific as well. That's the second thing. It has to tell people, how are you actually going to operationalize this? What does this mean for your day to day? And so those are the two things I would say should be the starting point for companies in terms of how to define their culture, is to have conversations. Again, if you're a young, early stage startup, then have the conversations about what kind of company do you want to grow into? You know, what do you want to be as a company, I guess, when you grow up? And then the second thing is to think about, how do we talk to people outside of the company about what it's like to work for the company? So in that sense, what you're doing is both kind of having a almost culture roadmap and a culture inspiration point. So you're really trying to say, okay, this is how we want to inspire people. This is how we talk about ourselves as a company, and then this is the kind of company we want to be. So this is our roadmap. How are we going to start the building blocks of getting there? So I would say those are kind of my two framings for how should you get started with defining your culture. Getting on that path is easier said than done. So the 3 pointers I would give in that direction are: one, for a lot of early stage companies, typically speaking, the culture is defined by the founding team's strengths and weaknesses. That's just in tech, that tends to happen. It's, if I am the CEO or the CTO or the founding executive team, if I'm really innovative, really bold, then that becomes part of the company culture. If I am a really good salesperson and that's my key inherent strength, then you'll see that the company tends to have a very sales driven culture. So one, look at your founding team, whether you are the founding team or if you are an employee, look at your founding executives, and what do their strengths and weaknesses tell you about the kind of culture that's being built. Second is, write down the company's story. It's really important, again, to be able to think about who we are and what do we want to communicate. And what's really helpful with this is that it helps as you continue to grow for new employees to be able to engage. So to help those new employees understand, oh, this is the story of the company I'm joining, and this is how people think about it. And then the third thing is, talk about your culture. Talk about it all the time, because culture is something that evolves. When you go from being 5 people to 15 people, it's going to change. When you go from 15 to 25 people, it's going to change. So you have to keep talking about it, because as you keep talking about it, you'll realize it's innovating and it's moving and it's changing and it's becoming something different. And so then you need to go back to the things that we talked about. Again, what kind of company do you want to be? How do you want people to talk about you? So it's almost like an iterative cycle. You don't just start and stop. It doesn't have an endpoint. It kind of just keeps going, and it needs continuous reflection and innovation. Um, the second thing I'll say is that when it comes to talking about building culture or sustaining culture or continuing to innovate on it, people often ask, well, how do I prioritize? I'm growing, my company is growing, I'm trying to hire people. We have to think about what processes we have, how do we work with each other, what tools do we use, what do we use to do our project management, what do we use to do our internal communication? And sometimes what tends to happen is people then focus on those tools and processes more than the culture. And so you end up in this situation where a company thinks, well, as I'm growing, what I need to prioritize is building our systems and frameworks and tools, and not focus so much on the culture. The culture, we've already put down the principles. We know who we are as a company. We don't need to talk about it more. Let me give you an example of what can happen if you go down that path. What ends up happening in that situation is we end up running the risk of changing how we work without having learned how to work together in the first place. So if I focus my time on saying, oh, my team is doing a lot of creative work, so we should use a storyboarding tool. So let's do the research on what storyboarding tools we should use. I haven't spent the time thinking about, well, what does it mean that our team does a lot of creative work together? How do we harness that creativity? How do we provide a culture where people feel like, what does it mean to be creative? Does it mean that I can come up with new ideas and keep working on them all the time? Or does it mean that once I come up with a new idea, then I need to really concentrate on that, and that's going to be my priority? So if you haven't given people those guidances or those principles, then the tools will not help on their own. So the takeaway there I would share is kind of doing it in a step-by-step process of, again, focus on building the culture of how do you work together, then bring in the tools and the processes, and then focus on scaling it. And as you scale it, you'll then learn what else you need to do, and then you'll go back to looking at the culture again. So again, kind of doing that loop. The last thing I want to leave you all with are a couple of strategies that I have found really helpful to keep these conversations going, and particularly for those of you who maybe are not in a tech startup, but instead are in a growth startup. In a growth tech company. So you've kind of already gone through the couple of iterations and you're like, my company's not at the stage where it's defining its culture. So what can I do in that situation? We can do a few things. One is using this thing called start, stop, continue. So do those in small teams, do those in big teams, do them in however it makes sense. But doing this exercise of, let's all get together and talk about, hey, what should we start doing as a company or as a team within our company that would be really useful to how we work together or what we do? And then what are the things we should stop doing? We have started doing this stuff and really it's not productive. It's not part of our culture. This is not how we want to work together. So let's start doing these things. And then the third is identifying things that make you work well together and make people happy about being in a work situation together. So what are the things you should continue doing? So using the strategy of start, stop, continue. My company, we used to have a Kanban board where we track this on a monthly routine, and people would drop in those ideas, and then we would get together as a team once a quarter and talk through what people have been saying. The second strategy, specifically for those of you who are in leadership positions, I would say is to follow what's kind of the 3 Ls of listen, learn, and lead. Spend a lot of time listening to people, really trying to understand what are they saying to you. We talk about this a lot in the product space of listen to your customers' problems, focus on what the problems are. Same thing with culture. Listen to what your team members are saying, your managees are saying to you. Learn from it, and then lead the change that you want to see or the change that you want to inculcate by leading with it, by being the person who shows it by example. The last thing I'll say is in the product space, a lot of us tend to have one-on-one check-ins. It's very common to have this one-on-one with your team lead or your manager, or if you work in Scrum, then you might be doing it with your product manager. A lot of times those meetings tend to start with the, hey, how are you doing? And we do this in our daily lives too, right? We ask someone, hey, how are you doing? And usually the response is, I'm good, I'm fine. And you kind of move on. You didn't learn anything about that person from it. Nothing changed. This is a really small thing in terms of building culture, but replace the how are you doing with something a little bit more tangible. In your one-on-one meeting, ask someone, hey, what's the best thing that happened to you this week? Or, hey, tell me, what's the hardest thing you've had to do this week? Or what's the thing that made you laugh or made you cry? Ask very specific, intentional questions that will tell you things. If you ask your team members, hey, what's the hardest thing you had to deal with this week? They might tell you about maybe a conflict they had with somebody in the team, or maybe something that they're struggling to work on. create the kind of culture where people feel like you are interested in what they have to tell you, and that you want to actually know how they're feeling and how they're doing rather than asking a very generic question. Again, particularly given how we're all working remotely right now, a lot of you are learning how to manage your teams remotely. One of the other things I would suggest is something that's very specific to our times right now. You know, ask people what's giving them hope at the moment. Ask people, hey, you know, what are you going to take away from this experience of us living in this world where we're dealing with a pandemic? You know, ask them what you think this experience has changed about them. So really take the time to again learn something about what people might have to say in that context, without just simply asking, you know, the question of like, how are you doing? And 9 out of 10 times, for example, my team would just tell me in the beginning, oh, you know, I'm coping. Yeah, it's tough being at home, and you know, then that would be it. And so go a little bit deeper. Hey, what's tough about being at home? And and reflect on what again is your culture and how you want to make a difference for what that employee is sharing in this context. So I'll stop there. I think I have a couple more minutes. I'd love to hear questions and what your reflections are on any of this or anything else related to this. How would you deal with cynical or confrontational attitudes towards the culture you're trying to build? Good question. So I think I would segment between the two. I think if people are cynical, it's because it takes time to see the change. So be open about that, right? Be open about the fact that like this doesn't mean things are going to happen overnight. Culture doesn't just happen like this. It takes time. It has to be intentional. So get people to recognize that they have to give it time. If it's confrontational, try and understand where that confrontation is coming from. What's leading to it? What's behind that? Is it fear? A lot of people don't like change. People fear change because it can be difficult. You don't know what's going to happen next. So it's very natural to kind of feel defensive about it. So kind of break down the barriers bit by bit of really trying to understand what's causing you to be confrontational in that situation. Any thoughts on how to make the conversation fun and interesting? Oh, yes. Engage people. Have you know, do things like using a storyboarding tool, for example. Get people to share crazy ideas. In our team, we did this exercise once where we said, you know, okay, we need to do something, but let's actually start with all of the terrible ideas that you can come with. So we sat around for 20 minutes throwing out the worst ideas we could possibly think of. And it was fun, but it also gave us a really good starting point for, okay, that's not something that we want to do. So maybe go the other way, maybe make it fun in that sense. How do you think traditional performance reviews can evolve? It's a good question. I think for a lot of the workforce, it is about having not just the one annual performance review that gives you feedback, and that, for example, one-on-one meetings are a really good way to do this. So I have weekly meetings with everybody who reports to me directly on my team, which means that on a weekly basis, we're sort of doing a mini performance review. You know, we talk through what's working well, what's not working well. So I think that's one of the ways that it can evolve. Don't make it just be something that you do once a year in a very formal, structured way. Maybe that works, and especially it's required in certain situations, but don't hold feedback just up until that point. Use it in a more regular feedback cycle. This is a lot of questions, so I think I'm reading kind of the last bits. I will say, for those of you who want to continue the conversation, I'm on the Women Tech Network Slack channel, so feel free to reach out to me there or on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk if I don't get through all these questions, because I think I might get thrown off in the next minute or two. Do you distinguish between promoting an employee brand and the culture, or how do you see it as the same? Good question. So I think a lot of companies tend to talk about, for example, the benefits that they provide when you ask about what your culture is. And that is not the same thing. The company can provide a lot of benefits, and that can help build their brand, or that can be representative of what they want people to know about them. But a culture is really in the sense of how do you show up? So ask those questions, for example, when you're interviewing with a new company, ask them like, hey, you say this is how we operate as a company. Tell me what that means. When, for example, companies say we really care about career advancement. So ask them, what professional development opportunities do you provide? What networking opportunities, what mentorship opportunities do you provide? When companies say we're innovative and we value ideas, ask them like, what space do you create for those kinds of innovation and sharing of ideas? And, when was the last time an idea suggested by an employee made a difference or made it to the list for you? So ask the questions so that companies can actually tell you, what are you doing that makes a difference? I'm going to keep talking until I get bumped out, I guess. Let's see. Someone said, right, I'm a little introvert, so not sure what to say if they ask the same question back for me. Not sure what the question is, but I guess if people are asking how you're feeling, it's okay to not feel like you are ready to talk in the moment. So be open about it and say, hey, I'm not sure I really know how to talk about how I'm feeling right now. I'm still processing it. It's difficult for me to put it into words, but I really appreciate that you took the time to ask me about it. Let me think about it and maybe I'll come back to you, or give yourself time to process it. And if you feel comfortable, then talk about it. I think the important thing isn't that it's meant to make you feel uncomfortable or make you feel like you're being put in the spotlight, but it's more to be able to feel like you are finding ways to connect with each other and learn about each other. So think of it from that lens and not feel like you're going to be judged for what you're saying or that you have to come up with something spectacular. I am going to post in the chat my LinkedIn and also my Calendly for anyone whose company is working through this exercise right now and would want to talk further. Feel free to put 30 minutes on my calendar. I'm very happy to have these types of discussions for organizations that are kind of either at the early stage of figuring this out or even going through the process right now. So feel free, and thank you all for taking the time and joining.